Um, so he was working until his death.
Yeah.
He actually couldn't have chosen a better place to end his life than his own lab.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that, how he died?
Yeah, well, he, the sort of key event that led to his death was he was climbing up a ladder in his library and reaching for a book, and he slipped and fell. And to me, that was, such kind of a poignant and symbolic way for Warburg to reach the end, sort of climbing, reaching for more knowledge, and then ending up, flat on the ground in his institute. It's an image that has stayed in my head. And what makes it all the more fitting in a way is that nobody came to help him because they were afraid to come into his library. He used that as his office. And so he just lay there alone without help for some time. And, he did recover from that and live for, I forget, around another year. But that was sort of the beginning of the end, and what I kind of think of as his death. And when I went to the library, there's a little placard on the third step of the ladder, which shows where he slipped. And just like the other thing is that in his library, he had picked 3 paintings on the wall: Robert Koch, Pasteur, and Ehrlich, and these were the 3 great scientists that had changed the world. And he saw himself as the 4th in this line. And that was really where all the symbols came together, with Warburg lying on the floor before these men.
What a poignant way to die.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that no one discovered that he'd slipped because the curtains were closed. And when the curtains were closed, it meant that he didn't want to be disturbed, and he was doing serious work.
Right.
Everyone probably left him alone.
Yeah, so they did, after a while, somebody came in, and found him, but, it probably wouldn't have made a difference in terms of how long he survived, but it is, this man who was so arrogant that, his arrogance ultimately, it's like a morality tale. His arrogance ultimately led him to lie there alone and be isolated from the world. So it's a striking image, I think.
Also striking in terms of how he led his life, because he really isolated himself from everyone else. He had no intention of making friends. That wasn't in his agenda. In fact, he alienated other scientists by directly attacking them or talking unkindly of them in some of the papers he published.
Yeah, it got to the point where it was almost a compliment to be insulted by Warburg. It was like a rite of passage for a young scientist. But he had Heiss. He had a few other scientists that he liked. He liked Hans Krebs and a few others. But they called him the Emperor of Dahlem, the Kaiser of Dahlem. That's his neighborhood in Berlin. He would ride around on his horse and live like a king. And kings don't need that many friends. They have their helpers, and it's just his personality. People have asked me in other interviews, like, how did he end up this way? I personally think he was just born that way. Ultimately, you can't create somebody with that personality.
And Mike, you do refer to him as a narcissist in your book.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm sure it was encouraged by different trends and by growing up among Nobel Prize winners, but ultimately he was born a narcissist, I believe.
He probably was, because he meets all the criteria.
Yeah, but the fascinating thing for me is that I feel like usually when you see somebody with that personality, they're not also incredibly brilliant. I would think of those 2 things as being in contradiction. I think he's among the rare narcissists who is also truly a genius.
Yes, he was. So he was, I think, for a little while, perhaps 10, 20 years, his theory was forgotten. The world didn't even mention him in cancer books. In fact, some of the cancer books published in the 70s did not even mention Warburg's name. And I was actually intrigued to find out it was Thomas Seafried that brought him back to life, that gave him the credit that he deserves.
Yeah, I mean, Seafried definitely played a role in that. There were some others as well, but yeah, it's one of the most remarkable things is how dramatically Warburg fell off the map in mainstream. There were always people more on the fringes who remained interested, but in mainstream cancer science, in the post-war period for several decades, he just vanished. You look at all these papers, the seminal paper, The Hallmarks of Cancer, which describes, these 6 key features of what cancer cells do. It doesn't mention metabolic alterations of cancer cells, which is so fundamental. This famous textbooks that comes out in 2006 by Robert Weinberg, also wrote The Hallmarks of Cancer, or co-wrote it. The textbook doesn't mention Warburg. You have The Emperor of All Maladies, a very fascinating, well-written book, but doesn't mention Warburg. Scientists who wanted to study metabolic changes in cancer cells, really had very little outlet. No one wanted to publish articles about that. And so it returned into the mainstream only in the late 90s. At the time, everybody was interested almost entirely in oncogenes, and they were trying to understand how these cancer-causing genes work. And they started to see that they actually work, or some of the key ones work, by controlling metabolic processes. So there's this synthesis, and a lot of these scientists like Chi Van Dang and Matthew van der Heijden and Craig Thompson and Lewis Cantley that I talk about in my book brought this stuff back from the fringes into the mainstream, and really set off a sort of modern, what I call a Warburg revival.
Sam, I have another 10 minutes. I know we're over an hour now. Would you like a drink, or do you like to take a break?
Yeah, I'll take another. I'll pour myself a little more to drink.
So maybe about 10 minutes.
Okay, that sounds great. And thank you, by the way. I've done a lot of interviews, but I don't think anybody has asked me such specific questions about the history, and some of the stuff I had almost forgotten about. So I thank you for reading it so closely and asking such good questions.
Well, using my linguistics background, so
yeah, it's very gratifying for an author to see that somebody has read so closely.
Yeah, it's all right. Now, at some point throughout Warburg's life, scientists were able to identify sugar specifically as being the culprit in the Western diet that's causing cancer. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was and remains controversial, but going back, even to the very early 20th century, people were seeing that sugar and refined carbohydrates were responsible for obesity. Gary Taubes has written a lot about this, and a number of people did in fact point out that sugar in particular seemed to be linked to cancer in terms of just epidemiology studies. They didn't have any evidence in terms of what's happening biologically, but they could see that populations that tended to eat a lot of sugar, had more obesity, more diabetes, and eventually they saw that cancer was a part of this too. And so that it was always a suspicion, and carbohydrates in particular, sugar is of course one type of carbohydrates, but they, in feeding studies of mice and other rodents, they've been able to see that carbohydrates were linked to cancer, but it was all very unclear. I think you couldn't make a conclusive case about sugar in particular in the first part of the 20th century. And it became more clear, in the second part of the 20th century, partially because the epidemiology continued, but partially because, we got this extremely important clue at the end of the 20th century about the link between obesity and cancer. So now, whatever causes obesity, I think you can fairly say causes cancer, and that sugar is linked to obesity, I think is not controversial.
Yes, you do mention that. It was very clear that there's a direct link between sugar and diabetes, or a high carbohydrate diet and diabetes. But the link, although it was known that there was a link, but it wasn't as clear between the link between our diet or sugar. and cancer. That link was not as clear, and they couldn't explain it, but they could identify that there was a link. But even as early as the 1900s, they ran a number of studies on mice, and they found that mice who developed cancer had higher or elevated glucose levels.
Yeah, it's this is one of the real challenges of the book is explaining and understanding all of this, because there's many different layers to the story. Warburg discovered that a cancer cell takes up a lot of glucose. And then we do these studies, carbohydrates, of course, break down to glucose. So we think, simply if you eat a lot of glucose, then cells will get more glucose and they'll get more cancer. But it's not necessarily that simple. You have, for example, many Asian populations eating a ton of rice and not getting cancer. So then we have to look at, is it all carbohydrates or certain carbohydrates in the diet that are particularly dangerous? And when I say sugar, I mean not glucose, which is also unfortunately sometimes just referred to as sugar, but specifically the molecule sucrose, which is 1/2 glucose and 1/2 fructose. And that combination seems to be uniquely bad. And when you mix that into a diet, then suddenly all carbohydrates tend to lead to these underlying metabolic abnormalities, insulin resistance first and foremost. And that's, I think, the process by which, all these problems arise. So it's important to make these distinctions, and it's unfortunate that we tend to use the same word sugar for these different types of carbohydrates. But when I say in Ravenous that I think, sugar is uniquely harmful, what I'm really talking about is the sweet white stuff, the sucrose. I think that if you never ate sucrose, you could probably, eat a lot of certain types of carbohydrates and still, be relatively healthy.
What fascinated me, I know this isn't about cancer, it's about diabetes, was that, and you do mention it in your book, was that the American Diabetes Association recommended that diabetics eat fructose, but avoid glucose, which was the evil twin of fructose. But they recommended that everyone eat fructose because of course fructose doesn't cause elevation, blood sugar elevation in the same way as glucose would.
That's exactly right. And I can see how they, it's incredibly unfortunate, but you can see how they made the mistake, because if you just think in terms of blood sugar, then you take the fructose, as you said, and it seems to be relatively benign. A lot of it is ending up in the liver. What they didn't understand is that it's ending up in the liver and it's producing liver fat, and that's causing the insulin resistance, and it's the insulin that's then getting elevated and driving more glucose into the cells. So they missed it, really. That's what it comes down to. And there's still, many people to this day are still missing this part of the story. It's not, I don't think, well understood even in the medical world.
Well, I'm very passionate about diabetes because I'm type 1 diabetic myself. And you mentioned there's just one sentence in the book where you do mention type 1 diabetes. And I went, hey, thank you for that. Thank you for mentioning us, because we're here too. We exist. So I was very pleased.
I think that I was just going to say that, a lot of this stuff that I'm interested in terms of low carbohydrate nutrition, it's been extraordinary for type 1 diabetics, and being able to use much less insulin on these diets. And I think it's really incredible.
Yes, because they were talking about insulin. They were actually questioning whether cancer was caused by elevated levels of blood sugar, or whether it was the elevated levels of insulin. And we still have that question. We're still asking that question and trying to find answers. Mm-hmm. So it was fascinating that, even 30 years ago, they'd identified insulin as the possible cause. And now I think we know, now the science is more sort of solid about that. We know that hyperinsulinemia causes, and it's not necessarily your blood sugar, but hyperinsulinemia causes at least certain types of cancer, including breast cancer and prostate cancer.
I personally, think it's, it's the key takeaway from Ravenous, in my opinion, is that we are missing the hyperinsulinemia story. Not that we don't know about it, but that it doesn't have enough focus in our society. You think about glucose in our blood. There's always glucose in the blood. You die if there wasn't, as you know, as a type 1 diabetic. So the question is, how are cells getting that glucose? And you need insulin, to take that glucose up, and, generally speaking. And, the body is really designed, is insulin, parsing out these nutrients. And if a cell is able to get more insulin because it has more insulin receptors, or because it has a genetic mutation in this PI3K pathway that allows it to get more insulin, it's going to have a growth advantage. And, it's not going to die. It's going to continue to get this, this signal from insulin to stay alive and thrive. And we know that insulin drives obesity, of course. So, I think the underlying story is not necessarily that obesity is causing these cancers, but that insulin is driving simultaneously obesity and cancer.
Yes. So insulin is a much needed hormone. My body doesn't make it. So I have to wear an insulin pump to get my insulin. But the question is, how much insulin does one need to survive? So do we just need a basal level of insulin, or do we need a lot more than that? And I think it's the amount of insulin generated by the body that's causing these problems. It's not the insulin, the hormone per se. And that's something I'm worried about. I'm scared about overusing insulin. I want to maintain good blood sugars, obviously. I want to keep myself alive. I have to take my insulin, but I don't want to overdo it, because it's not like I can't take it like candy.
Yeah. I mean,
resistant eventually. So.
Yeah, I mean, what's upsetting is, you clearly have this knowledge, but many people are getting diagnosed with type 1 or type 2 diabetes and being told, just eat whatever you want and take your insulin. That's what's upsetting, that, even though we now have this knowledge, that message, still being given to patients.
Sam, our channel is called Low Carb and Fasting. Now, we did talk about the importance of low carbohydrate nutrition, about avoiding sugar, specifically sucrose. We talked about insulin. What are your thoughts about fasting or intermittent fasting?
Yeah, I don't, I feel like it's too soon to say for sure. I think, I've seen the latest studies, and that don't provide, obvious advantage for people that are, doing this intermittent fasting. But I also know that there's some problems with those studies. What is clear to me is that in rodent studies of cancer, it does seem to show an advantage to intermittent fasting. So I remain optimistic that it's going to be shown to be, demonstrated to be a very helpful tool for some people. I certainly know anecdotally many people who were doing low carb were not making enough progress, and then added in intermittent fasting, and then sort of were able to get over the threshold and do better. So I think that there's a lot of hope that it's going to be a big innovation, but I try to not get ahead of the evidence. Even at the end of my book, I thought about talking about low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets for cancer treatment. I decided not to do that, and to only focus on prevention, because I just like to wait for the science to catch up, is my feeling.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning here that Thomas Seyfried, for example, uses not only ketogenic diet, he has his own protocol, obviously, but also fasting.
Yeah.
As a treatment for cancer. And he's had some success stories which were published online. Well, I can not thank you enough for making the time for us today.
Yeah, no, I want to thank you, and thank you for reading the book so closely and for asking such good questions.
Before we say bye, can you remind our audience how they can purchase the book, and also where they can find you on social media?
Sure, the book should be available wherever books are sold, I would hope. You can certainly find it online at Amazon and other online bookshops. And I'm somewhat active on Twitter at Sam_Apple1, and my website is samapple.com. And I'm always happy to hear from readers.
And you're also on Instagram, Sam Apple Books.
Yeah, I'm bad at Instagram. Don't look at that.
You're on Instagram, Sam Apple Books. Finding people, follow him, support him. And thank you very much for listening to this long broadcast. Thank you very much, Sam. Have a
Thanks.
good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.